So here we go. So live on Facebook and streaming from Zoom, we're going to talk about how to invest using subject to the existing mortgage, which is something that you often hear people talking about. And a lot of people don't understand it. And why I think this is a timely topic is because now is the time that we're going to be able to do more subject to investing, because there will be more and more people who are in a situation where they're not able to pay. They're going to forbear their mortgages, and 2 or 3, maybe 6 months down the road, there'll be people that have suddenly, depending on how their mortgages are in forbearance, they may have a big payment due that they're not going to be able to make. And so there might be a surge of people needing to a quick sale, kind of solve their problem, and would be willing to do subject to. So before we get into the meat of this, for those of you who are on here, go ahead and pop in the chat where you're from, what kind of investing you do, what kind of questions you have, and have you ever done any subject to the existing mortgage investments before? And while we're doing that, Cody and Chris, why don't you give quick intros, and then we'll just jump into the topic here.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Chris here. I work with Cody and Paul, and I'm the sales guy on the team. So I work in tandem with Cody and Paul to do subject tos and to creatively finance deals or, purchase deals at a discount. And I'm happy to be on here with you guys and talk more about subject to. I really enjoy teaching and learning more about how we can be better or better serve you. So happy to be here and happy to have you guys.
And yeah, my name is Cody. If you haven't seen us before, we are a threesome here. We do work together, and I'm part of the marketing side of things. So I fill up the pipeline and looking to get more deals secured.
Good. We have Carlo jumped on here. Anybody else? Are y'all able to see the comments on?
Yeah, I can see the comments, but not Facebook.
Okay. All right. Somebody's sitting there in Maryland, and they haven't done any subject twos, but they've been interested in doing it for about 8 months or so. Okay. Well, we're going to really dig into the meat of this today. So what I'm going to do is I want to share my screen, and I have a presentation here that kind of goes into the meat of it. Here we go. So you should be able to see my screen now. And so we're going to make this quick, kind of light, and you guys can ask questions as we go. We're going to do intros, which we just done. I'm going to start digging into the explanation and go through some mechanics. I'll go through an actual case study of the first sub two that I did, and then we'll open up to Q&A. But along the way, as I'm talking here, we just have a few slides. Go ahead and jump in and ask questions, and Chris and Cody are going to help me field those. Which one of you guys have it on Facebook?
I do now.
Okay, so Cody's going to field the Facebook chat, and then Chris, if you don't mind, field in the Zoom chat, and let's just dig into it. So first off, who are we and why are we talking about this? So all three of us are full-time real estate investors based in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we don't have day jobs anymore. Real estate is all we do all day, every day. And even on Saturday nights, we talk about real estate. And collectively, we hold 50 plus properties, and collectively, we've done over 100 deals. And I've stopped keeping track. It's not that fun to keep track anymore. I just prefer to do deals. And my name is Paul David Thompson, and I host a podcast called Ready Investor One. I also have my own YouTube channel, and I run a mastermind. And while I was developing as a real estate investor, I promised that as I learned things, I would kind of collect it and then share it back and kind of pay it forward, because there were a lot of people that helped me. So that's kind of what we're doing right now. And so now let's talk about what is subject to investing. So just the term subject to simply is a word structure that says an exception to what's said after it. And then in the real estate context, it is an exception to title. So it is very common when looking at a title report that will say, we say there's clean title here, subject to these exceptions, subject to this easement, which may stay there forever, subject to satisfying this mortgage that is currently in place, or subject to the existing mortgage, which is what we do as real estate investors, which is a little bit different construct, because what we're doing is we're saying, I want to buy this property, but I'm not going to satisfy the mortgage. I'm going to keep the mortgage in place, which is not common. And so we give the exception of subject to the existing mortgage. So and subject to type phrases and structures are used commonly amongst familiar parties. So if me and my family were doing a transaction and we had a business together, we might keep a mortgage in place and just do it because we trust each other because we're family. Whereas investors use it, we do it when there's specifically somebody who's having trouble in their financial situation, or their house needs a lot of work, and they just have this payment looming over them that they can't solve for. And sometimes it's easier for them to buy it or to sell it, and for us to buy it subject to the existing mortgage, where we just agree to make the payments. They could be facing foreclosure. There could be some sort of distress in the family. It's a lot of scenarios. And when it makes sense, then we do subject to. One thing I will say about subject to is it is touted as a way to get into properties with low or no money down, which is true. However, you don't do it just because someone says yes to your offer. It has to make sense. There has to be cash flow. There has to be income. There has to be some reason to do it. Subject to. It is not the end all be all strategy. And the reason it's nice for investors is we're not traditionally bankable because we are recently out of our jobs and we don't have a traditional W-2. So we can't go down to the bank and get a bank loan in the same way that a W-2 employee can. So buying somebody else's financing is favorable to us because it's how we can get access to these lower interest rates of say 5-6%. But there are risks. When you are transferring a property, the deed from one person to another, and there's an underlying loan in place, and that third party is not qualifying for that loan, then it is possible, and the mortgagee has the right to call the loan due. Now, it's referred to as a due on sale clause. Now, this is not commonly done, but it does happen. And anytime you're buying a property subject to, you have to be able to solve for, in the eventuality if that happens, can you sell the property? Can you refinance? So you want to buy with equity so you have room to solve for the subject to due on sale concern. And also, I have found that sellers don't necessarily really understand. You try to explain to them what's going on, but they don't really understand. And 2 or 3 years later, they may come back and say, "Hey, well, what are you going to do with this mortgage?" I'm like, "Well, 3 years ago, we have paperwork that said that I'm going to make the payments." So you got to make sure on the front end, really set expectations and document what those expectations are, because you don't want to set somebody else up in a bad place. And then I just find dealing with the third party mortgage company that you're interacting with is kind of a hassle. So there are complications with subject to. Okay. So let's just kind of walk yourself through what we're going to do when you're looking at properties and you think that my subject to type deal might make sense. So you're finding a good deal, and you find out that they have a mortgage on the property, and they share with you their mortgage statement because you asked them for it, and you find out what the terms of the deal are. And so you analyze the deal and determine if it's a good deal for you or not. And if so, you fill out a contract, which I'll show you here in a minute, agreeing to buy the property subject to the existing mortgage, and that language is put in the contract. And then you get the mortgage release document, which I'll also show you, allowing you to contact the mortgage company and confirm the payoff details. This is commonly done by title companies anyway, because they need to get the payoff anytime the transaction is happening anyway. This is common practice. But in this case, your name's going to be on there as well. So you go through the normal due diligence process. Whatever you would normally do for a real estate transaction, you do for this kind of transaction as well. Inspection, title search, termite clearance, nothing is precluded because it's subject to. The only difference is that you're suddenly not going to pay off the mortgage. You're just going to make the payments. And then at the closing, here's one thing that's different. At the closing, you're signing or transferring the deed from the seller to your entity. And then at closing, you're also signing a settlement statement that calls out what that amount is. And there's a little field in the HUD or the settlement statement that says this is the value that is not being satisfied and being bought subject to. And then you also, very, very, very important, is that you get a limited power of attorney that allows you to deal with the mortgage company. If you don't do that, you might be in a pickle. You may have to just refinance because you can't get the power of attorney set up. So before I kind of blew through that, any questions that popped up on those topics, guys?
Yeah, I have one. We don't have any comments on Facebook yet, but one thing is does it have to be put into a trust, or can it just be person to person?
Good question. It does not have to transfer to a trust or an entity. You can buy it in your personal name. I'll talk in a minute why I think it's probably smarter to transfer it into a trust, but that's kind of an advanced topic. I want to get down to the kind of the basics first. So, Chris, did you have one as well?
So why would a seller do a subject to instead of selling the property outright to someone like an investor?
Yeah. So this is probably the most common question that I get is, why in the world would someone do this in the first place? Well, under normal circumstances, most people would not sell a property subject to. What some people find is that they're afraid to ask, and because they never ask, then it never comes up. If you're willing to ask, then a seller who is in distress, and mind you, this is the reason it makes sense for a seller, is if the alternative is foreclosure and potentially bankruptcy. So oftentimes that is, you're saving them from some sort of calamitous condition coming at them, and you can step in and start making their payments. And when you start making payments, you're taking on a big responsibility, and your promise and your kind of moral code there is that if you agree to make payments, then you better make payments. So they are putting a lot of trust into you as the buyer when you're buying subject to. So do not take that lightly.
And just to, I kind of want to further that point too. One example that I see often is people just, they want out of their house. So people get in their mind that they just want to leave their house. And they're like, we'll do whatever it takes. And as an investor, sometimes that number that they owe doesn't make sense for us to purchase outright. And so a subject to, in that case, such that it still has the equity that we desire, still works for us, then you kind of walk them down that path, and and they agree to it. I also always mention the risks up front.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to hide anything ever, especially because this is a huge risk on their part, and it also is on ours as well. So I want to make that clear up front that is there are risks involved.
And so the paperwork that you're going to have is the normal purchase and sale contract, which I'm going to do a screen share here in a minute. Your normal disclosure, or there are some additional disclosures that I like to use. I like to call out the due on sale, and that they should not contact the mortgage company on my behalf. That's not their responsibility anymore; it's mine, because I don't want them to accidentally trigger a flag that says, "Oh, well, this has happened." And then the mortgage release, which I mentioned a second ago, and then I actually show you a power of attorney. And again, I'm going to disclose or disclaim here that we're not attorneys. We're just showing you paperwork that we use. And at the end of this, we'll give you a way for you to get access to the recording of this and all this paperwork. Of course, use at your own risk. Take it to attorney, and you make a decision based on yourself. Your attorney may change it if you're in a different state than what we are. So let's actually take a look at, so the contract. Let's go there first. No, this one. Somewhere in here. Got too many. See if I can find it. There it is. So this is a common format of a purchase and sale agreement that we use. And I'll let you get a copy of this. I won't go through the whole thing, but what I'll notice here is the purchase price. We put it right here, and then if we choose to, we can do subject to, and this is how we do it. We say we will buy it subject to the existing mortgage, and then in this little section right here, we actually put the price, the value of the unpaid balance of the loan that we get from the mortgage company, and that it becomes the purchase price of the transaction if we're not paying the seller extra. Sometimes we just pay it. If they owe 70 and we buy it for 70, and we take on the closing costs and we take on the payments going forward. And so that's where we put that in there. And then a bunch of jargon. And then here we have some additional terms and agreements, and the ones that are highlighted there is that we basically say if the balance by the lender statement shows higher, then the purchase price of the transaction will change based on whatever the mortgage company tells us, because each time there's a payment made or there's payments not made, then the unpaid balance changes. We get that from the lender, and that's what we put in there as the purchase price. In section D there, if purchasing property to the, if buyer is purchasing subject to existing mortgage, the first payment shall not be due 30 days after closing. And so we basically are not saying that the day we close is the day that we're making the first payment. We usually pay the next payment because most payments are paid in arrears with mortgages. And E, this is really important because the seller will say, what happens if you don't pay? Well, if it doesn't pay, then we convey the property back to the seller upon written request. So basically we're setting up the seller so that we're responsible for it. But if we don't execute properly, then they get the property back. And why would we put money into a property, rehab, closing costs, make payments for a couple months or years, and then give the property back to the seller? That's not in our best interest. So our interest in that regard align, in that the transaction only makes sense if we are making the payments. It only makes sense for them if we're making the payments for them. Okay, any questions about the purchase and sale agreement? You guys see?
No.
Okay. If not, I'll jump over here to, and this is the limited and specific power of attorney. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but this was written up by an attorney. And basically what it does is it gives us right to contact the mortgage company and make changes to the insurance, update the mailing address, log into their mortgage portal if they have one set up that's only unique to this account, that sort of thing. And it gives us the power, the specific power to do something on this property only. Okay, what else? Let's see. And then this is the disclosure statement. So this is like a seller's acknowledgments that I go through, and it has a whole bunch of details. And I'll let you guys read this at your own leisure when I send this to you afterwards. But this kind of sets those expectations that I was talking about very clearly, and they have to sign each one of those. So this is not a loan. The buyer is entitled to make a profit. They were advised to talk to legal counsel, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, we're not making any promises other than we're going to make payments.
And I do want to mention one thing that you hit on there, Paul, is that the buyer, so when we are taking on the payments, I always mention to them that if we are to resell the property, that we'll satisfy the mortgage first, but any additional profit goes to us.
Yeah, good call.
And I do make that clear because it is a risk for us to take on a property, you know, with repairs and such. And so anyway, I say that to say, to further that point, we can take the profit. And I always mention that, make sure that that's one way that we'll make money on that transaction.
Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, after all, we're investors, and the only reason we're doing this is to make a profit. But we want to do it at the service of others, not the expense of others. So we got to create the situation so it's a win-win for both parties. And this is the last piece of paper that I'll show you here. It's the due on sale clause disclosure. And so the seller is the one signing this, saying that they're not going to contact the mortgage company on our behalf. It is now our responsibility as the buyer to manage the mortgage company and update the insurance and make payments. And if for some reason payments aren't being made or some kind of issue, they contact us. The mortgage company knows to contact us to take care of it. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. And so the last two items on here are called trust document and assignment of beneficial interest. And it's a bit of an advanced topic. So one of the potential solutions for the due on sale clause is to transfer title from the seller to a trust called the 123 Main Street Trust, and then have the beneficiary of that trust be the seller, and then in a separate document have an assignment of beneficial interest. A beneficial interest is the beneficiary of the trust and then transferring that over to our LLC afterwards. And the reason we do that is so that when you look on title 3 years down the road, it shows the 123 Main Street Trust as the owner, and it's not obvious that that was a transaction created by an investor. It's potential. A bank could assume, could make some judgments, but it's not a obvious flag that says this was one of those transactions, and that was some reason for us to cue some sort of our flag activity to accelerate the note and call the mortgage due at once. So it's not a foolproof solution, but it's just another layer to kind of to obfuscate what's happened on the public record. Okay, so let's kind of walk.
That's one thing that I actively use. I use that the most, and it's really just to kind of further that point. You got to walk them down this path and help them see how you're going to make that work, because due on sale clause is actually very scary for people to hear and understand what that means. And so I always explain this, it's a layer of protection, so to speak. Doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, but it's one way to defer that I guess due on sale from taking place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how to close. So you find a deal as you normally would, and then you present your offer and you get consent to the offer. And if it makes sense to buy it subject to, you make the offer subject to based on their loan value. And then you open up title as normal with your attorney or title company, depending on where you are. And then that's when you confirm the mortgage info and you do your due diligence. So part of your due diligence is getting the mortgage information and kind of confirming what you've heard from the seller. A lot of times the sellers, they don't actually know how much they owe. They don't really know what the difference between a pity payment is and just their principal and interest payment is. So you kind of have to kind of like slice through some conversations. And then at the back end, once you get under contract, you can contact the mortgage company and get it locked in that this is the actual details of this deal, so that you know if it makes sense for you to go forward. And if it does, you go to the closing table, you do all your inspections and all this kind of stuff. It's all checks out. And then at the closing table, you sign the deed that transfers the title from the seller to you or to your trust. And then you sign the HUD or settlement statement, depending on what's being used at the situation. And then you make sure that you get a power of attorney signed. Super important. And then separately, on the day of closing, you want insurance to be in place, and you want insurance in your name, not in the seller's name. And I do that outside of closing. I don't do that inside of closing, but you could if you wanted to, but it's already enough moving parts. I don't bother with that. I'm able to use an insurance company that's very quick and easy. But what's important is whoever is on title of the property needs to be the primary insured for the insurance policy. And then the seller and or your LLC needs to be the additional insured for on that title policy. So you'll have a primary insured, could be a trust or you or your LLC. And then whatever other entities are involved in the transaction need to also be named as additional insured, plus the original seller's name needs to be an additional insured. But remember, you can sign for the seller because you have a limited power of attorney on this specific property. So if there is ever an insurance claim, you can sign for them for that check. And then afterwards, you rent it or flip it or whatever you want to do to make sense of the property.
Hey, real quick here for the people on Facebook Live, if you have any questions or comments, just leave them right here in the comment section below. We'll get to those as well.
Yeah, we are monitoring those, so let us know if you have any questions about the presentation.
And same with the Zoom. I know we had a couple people join here. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
Yeah, let us know where you're from, what's going on in your life right now. It's about to storm here in Little Rock. We're going to have a big tornado night. So this
Paul, we got a question real quick on Facebook. Speaking with a mortgage company to confirm the terms of the loan, they sometimes ask where the roll is or the interest you have.
No, they. So if you have a mortgage release document, they can ask, but you don't have to tell them you have a mortgage release document. I present myself as the property manager because it's my property. So but it's not, there's no flags to reach out and find out what the payoff is for a mortgage. So this happens every time a transaction happens as a mortgage on a property and you're selling it and you're going to pay off the mortgage. Title companies do this every day. It's not a big deal. But they do need a mortgage release document that says they have permission to give that information away. So this is a case study of the first house that I bought subject to. It's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, all brick around, built in, I think, the 80s, if I recall. And it was in really good condition. And that's actually my son there on the side of the picture from 5 years ago when I bought it. He's like 3 feet taller now. And was just a really good property for me to do to begin with, because it needed so little work. And you'll see that the countertops are in good shape, the backsplash is good, the floor, the cabinets, there's nothing that property needed. All this property really needed was that stove to be fixed and a couple of light touch-ups here and there. I mean, like I think I spent literally less than $1,000, and this was the only property to date that I've ever done any work on myself, and it was a nightmare. And there was nothing to do on it, and it was still a nightmare because I could not figure out how to get that screw into that that new hinge into the.
I bet you learned real quick how to start outsourcing, huh?
Yeah. I'm not handy, and I never claimed to be. And that's the last time I think I picked up a screwdriver in the last 5 years. So here are the details of the transaction. So I bought it in 2015. Its ARV at the time was 94. Now it's probably more like 106. The PITI payment, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, the PITI payment was just a hair under $600, and the principal interest part of it was $470. So most of the time, these payments are in principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And that's a good information to have, but the insurance, you could potentially get that cheaper yourself as an investor, and the taxes you can find yourself. You really want to know what the principal and interest payment of that mortgage is, because the taxes and insurance, you kind of want to separate from your calculation, because you want to know that's a given. Any house you're going to buy, you're going to pay taxes and insurance. I want to know how much the principal and interest is. In this case, it was a little under $500, and the mortgage balance was right at $70,000, and the interest rate at the time was 5.3%, which seems high now, but 5 years ago that was pretty competitive. And that loan will mature in about 20 years from now. So when I bought it, it was about 5 or 6 years into the loan. And so being very generous, I'm saying repair and closing costs were $2,500. And at the time I rented it for $900. Now it rents for $1,000. And so in 2015, it wasn't that slick of a deal. It was only about $70 per month in cash flow after you calculate everything in. But I had nearly $24,000 in equity, and I was putting very little money into it. And the house was in fantastic condition. This property would not make sense if it needed a bunch of work. The only reason it made sense at this cash flow was because it had equity, and I wasn't taking on a whole lot of risk because I was buying it subject to. So now it has $36,000 worth of equity into it, and I paid it down, some amount of money. I can't remember how much, but so kind of a thin deal. This is not something I would get that excited about just on the cash flow. The only reason it made sense largely was because it was subject to. I would not buy this property $70,000 cash. No way. It just wouldn't be a good investment.
So essentially you're saying because you only had to bring a little cash to the table, you own large pieces of equity a little bit more.
Yeah. So would you put $2,500 into a property that had $24,000 in equity in it? That's the question I ask myself. And that isn't necessarily a sure thing, that you might have a better use of your money elsewhere to get more cash flow. At the time I was working, and it was like I'd only bought like 9 houses at the time. This is my 10th house. So I was just trying to get experience. I knew that it wasn't just like a fat deal. Today, would I buy this deal on those terms? I'm not sure I would. I think I would do something else with this property. And this is very common in subject to deals, is these kind of numbers. They're just almost right, but not quite. And only as if there's enough equity would I do this. There's no way I would have bought this property for $70,000 if it was worth like $75,000, and with $70 of cash flow. It just wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, and one other strategy you could potentially do on this one, especially because it didn't need much repairs, you could, put $2,500 in it, put it back on the market.
Absolutely. Good point.
And market at 90% ARV.
Totally. I'm really glad you said that, because that was kind of my backup clause, or my backup strategy, is that I knew I could flip this on the open market with very little work. I mean, I could put probably less than $5,000 on the high end, $5,000, to make it just look really clean for a retail sale, and be able to make up $10,000 after all the transaction fees. Okay. So here's this kind of advanced topic of where you buy it in a trust. You find the deal, you do the same paperwork, the deed, you sign the HUD settlement statement as you normally would. You still get a power of attorney, but then additional document is that you have a trust agreement written up that says that the title is held as the, say, 123 Main Street Trust with John Doe as trustee. And then in this case, you would then transfer the beneficial interest of that trust to your LLC, like your APC LLC. And then the insurance is really important here. The primary insured would be the 123 Main Street Trust, John Doe as trustee with my PO box as the mailing address. And then you would have the additional insured as your ABC LLC, which with whatever mailing address they have. And then the Sally seller would be the additional insured, and then whatever address that you get your mail at. So you need to keep the seller's insurance on there, or the mortgage company will look at it as a flag, and then they'll do force placed insurance because the seller doesn't have insurance on it. And almost on a yearly basis, you have to go back and say, hey, we need to update the insurance. And sometimes they'll just like put force placed insurance, and you have to send them the power of attorney again every year, seems like, in order to remind them that you have the proper power of attorney and that you have insurance in place. All right, I saw a comment from Carlo. What did he say?
He said, because you're buying it subject to, part of the savings is avoiding points and possibly higher rates.
That's
from
right.
an HML and PML.
Yeah, hard money or private money lender. So if the same deal that I'm talking about here, my case study, if it wasn't subject to and it was a $70,000 purchase price, I could borrow money from a private lender. I could go to a hard money lender potentially. I could get a traditional mortgage to buy this property at those same numbers most likely. But there's transaction costs associated with that. There's almost none with the subject to, and you're not taking on the risk of the note in your own name. Your credit could not be good and still get this. So that still doesn't mean that you wouldn't make payments on this person's behalf, because you've promised that you would, and you're legally and morally obligated to do so. But that's what makes it so enticing to a seller or to a buyer to do this, is because you can do this as a way to bootstrap your business. But I would still caution anybody to don't look at this as a get rich quick scheme and only have $500 to your name and maybe have have a lot of personal debt on you, credit card debt, and then buy a property. And then what happens if the HVAC goes out and you have renters in there without heat or cooling, and you got to spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to replace the thing, and you don't have the money for it. So you want cash reserves when you're investing in real estate. So don't, but if you only have $10,000 of cash reserves, then I would like to reserve that $10,000 for the catastrophes and not for down payments. Reserve the money for these unexpected expenses and get into deals with little or no money. And that way you can stretch and get into 3 or 4 deals with only $10,000 to $15,000, $20,000. Because if you spend your first $20,000 on down payment and you're into a property for $70,000, it's worth $90,000. You've put all your $20,000 into equity into a deal that you can't easily get out. So now, if there's an HVAC problem, you're still in the same boat again. You just put yourself in a position you don't want to be in, which is not being liquid, especially in times like this.
That's why real estate is such a good game to leverage in. I mean, where else can you come in with $5,000 or less and own a $90,000 asset?
Right. And I definitely want to. Can you wholesale? Yes, you can wholesale subject to deals.
100%.
Yep. When you do so, though, I'll make a comment. When you do so, you are promising to make a payment, and then you're selling it to a third party to make those payments. So only wholesale to people who you feel like are going to take care of your seller. Because if you set up in a situation, you wholesale that to a third party, and that third party doesn't actually perform, I think it's still on you morally to step back in and fix that deal.
Yeah. And then he also asked, are other closing costs the same as buying it, or are the closing costs the same?
Yeah, there's no difference. There's no difference in transaction costs with a versus a private loan, for example.
And one other thing I'll mention about the subject too is, these people have to trust you, in order for you to do that. And so you obviously do build up a lot of rapport So if you do plan on selling it to a third party, wholesaling it, it's one of those things where I would be upfront about it and bridge that gap, because that person should have a relationship with them, because I personally believe that they need to have confidence in that person that's going to make the payments on their behalf, because that's a huge risk that they're taking on. And for us to not acknowledge that and then to just throw it to someone else, say, hey, go ahead and make the payments, it's to me, I don't feel good about it.
That's dirty pool. That's dirty pool.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Okay. I think that's the last slide. So we'll just open it up to a Q&A. If you want a copy of the documents that I use, I call it my sub-2 documents, or this recording, and these slides that I've written up here, so you can see those graphics that kind of shows you how it flows. You can text the word investor to the number 33777. So pull out your phone, text the new number of 33777 and hit the word investor, and it'll come right to me, and it'll ask for your email address, and then I will email you some free prizes. So has anybody on here done a subject to that's much watching live or on Zoom? Do you believe it's possible if you're listening? So we do. Manuel said he has. He's raised his hand anyway. Let's see if we have any questions that we haven't addressed.
Nothing over here on Facebook yet.
So Phoenicia says they have also. Okay, good. So you know how to do this. Did I cover and turn it into rent to own? Perfect. So Phoenicia or Manuel, did I cover anything new or different that you didn't know about, or are you doing anything different than what we're doing?
I love that Manuel turned that into a rent to own. That's also another powerful strategy with those subject twos, because from a rent to own standpoint, the person who comes in to, rent to own it, they're going to make all those repairs or anything that's needed to the property.
I agree.
And you can get a down payment and recoup any transaction fees or, small repairs.
Yeah, for example, this property was in good shape. I was new enough at the time that I wasn't doing rent to owns at the time, but I could have sold this on a rent to own and gotten $2,000 to $5,000 down payment, and that could put some cash back in my pocket, and then rent it for $900 like I know I did, and then hopefully the next 2 to 5 years, then the rent to own buyer would cash me out. So I have done that since then. I just intentionally wanted to keep it simple. I like rent to owns. It makes sense in a little bit higher end property. Like what I have here is what Class B. It would make good sense in Class B. I don't find rent to owns work very well in the low end Class C type properties. If the rent is less than $750, the class of people that can only afford a $750 place are probably have a very low likelihood of getting qualified for a loan. So I'm a little bit reluctant to get into rent to own there. That's more of an owner financing play. But anything 750 or higher, anything 750 or higher, and at least in our market, Class B plus, then rent to own makes a lot more sense. So they don't use a trust, as one person said. Yes. So Luke, just email me and I'll send you the docs. Everyone pretty much the same, but the power of attorney is crucial.
Sarah from Facebook, she's also done a sub too.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's gained a lot of popularity in the last few years. And I mean, people have been doing it for years, but it's just been talked about so publicly for so long that I just want to really caution people that to not overhype it or oversell it as this great silver bullet solution where you can get into a deal for no money and take no risk and basically play Russian roulette with somebody else's credit. Be very cautious of that. I treat the mortgages that I'm paying as strongly as my own house mortgage, because that's my reputation is important to me, and a lot of people are putting a lot of faith in you. So take care of those folks, because I'm not sure a seller really knows how much you could cause them mischief if you stop making payments.
Hey, we've got a really good question here on Facebook. The owner has come back to Sarah one time 5 years down the road because the income was too high and wanted it all paid off.
Yep.
Have you come across something like that where the owner has to cash out?
I have. Sometimes people's personal situations change and they didn't think about the complication of the debt to income ratio, because this mortgage is still in their credit. And so it does count against their debt to income ratio. And say the situation I came across is one family, I think they had another child. And so they wanted a bigger house. So the house they moved into was fine. They kind of had a pleasant surprise, a third child on the way. Okay, we want a bigger house now. Let's go find a bigger house. Oh, sorry, we can't get qualified because the VA loan that I have, they can only get, say, $400,000 limit, period. And the $200,000 mortgage that I'm paying subject to counts against them. So my agreement with them is that, yes, I have somebody in there doing rent to own. And when they are able to pay it off, then I'll solve for it. But I never promised that I would pay this off soon. I will try to accommodate as a gentleman's agreement. I'll try and accommodate this, but I am not legally or morally obligated to pay this thing off faster. And that's why I put those disclosures in on the front end. That's why it's so important to set expectations. You cannot, if this is 25 years left on this, I may just pay this for the next 25 years until it's paid off. I do not promise to pay it off early. Never promise that. If they need that, then subject to is not the right answer for them. And what's frustrating about it is 5 years later, or when you bought it, then that they may not have needed that, but their life changed, and 5 years later they do. So what I do in that case is I try and solve for it. I'll try and refinance. I'll try and get something else put in place. I'll get a private lender or something if I can accommodate it. If there's not enough room in the deal and I can't do it, I just got to tell them to wait.
And Paul, what about if there are there loans out there that are assumable?
There's a few. They're rare. It's a good question, Chris. Is that someone that someone asked, or did you?
No, it's just a question.
It's just you're so smart that you asked. Okay, good. So there are a few. So like VA loans in some cases can be assumed. But let's make the distinction that when you're doing subject to the existing loan, you are not assuming the loan. You're kind of quietly making the payments behind the scenes. You can't, if you're going to assume a loan, then you have to qualify for the loan before you can assume it. And some commercial loans here and there are assumable, and depending on the circumstances, you can talk to the bank. It depends on how bankable you are, of course, and the relationships, but they are not real common. But it can happen, but it's the exception, not the rule. That's a really good question.
All right. I don't have any. Paul, do you open up a trust with the name of the seller or the address and do that stuff?
So I've heard that argument. Or I've heard that you put it in it's Sally Smith is a seller, and so you put it as the Smith family trust is what you call it, and then afterwards you do the assignment of beneficial interest. I think it's kind of clever. However, the issue with that is that I don't want to ever be considered doing loan fraud or mortgage fraud. And I also don't want to have an issue with the seller who says, well, that's my family's name and I said it's mine. I mean, they could potentially go back and claim that they actually own the property all along. And maybe that the fact that it's in their family name makes it look like that more. I mean, I'm projecting that I have no case law that would say that, but I want to avoid those kind of concerns. And after you do enough properties, you can't keep track of what trust goes to what. So it just name it cleanest way, name it after the address, because how else are you going to remember? I mean, because say you end up selling the property later, it's hard to go back to necessarily going back to the county records to say, okay, what did I call that? Okay, that 103 Main Street, and I called it the Smith Family Trust. And it might be 5-10 years down the road, and something comes up where they say they claim they own the property and you sold it or whatever, and you're trying to remember find your paperwork, you can't. And don't leave yourself some breadcrumbs. I've done this long enough now to know that you don't remember the details of what happened on all these deals, especially as they do more. Keep clean paperwork so you can find your bread trails. But I find that being clever with the trust name is just kind of fun talk and not necessary.
And so do you take it under your LLC's name?
So throw the trust concept out of the way. You can just transfer it right into your LLC. You transfer it from seller to your ABC LLC and just deal with the due on sale clause if it ever gets called. Again, it's very low risk to do so. The most likely scenario where somebody bank would do that is if in a significantly rising interest market. I don't see that being the case for several years to come. With what's just happened, they just lowered the Fed rate again. It's going to be quite a few years before interest rates eke up over 6%, 7%, 8%. And that's when banks will say, well, these 5% loans I have back here, maybe we can go find some of them and call
them. Man, such an insidious way of the bank, making money.
Well, you can make the same argument that doing these quiet transactions behind the scenes is insidious as well. So I think we have a truce on these particular situations right now. Buy them with enough equity so you can sell them if you need to. Is the first email the only email with an attachment? Did you just sign up? No, I'll send you a separate one manually. The first one was automated, Phoenicia. I'm going to see who signed up tonight, and I'm going to send you all an email tomorrow morning because tonight I'm going to chill out. I'm going to watch something. I'm going to stream something. What is everybody streaming these days? What's something I should watch on Netflix or Prime?
Check
HBO.
Out Ozark.
I love it. I've already binged the entire third season.
Oh, have you?
Yeah. Last Sunday I watched the whole thing. That's probably my favorite show on TV right now. Is
Better
Ozark.
Be careful, Paul. You're about to finish Netflix.
Frozen 2. I've watched that one. House MD. I got 2 kids. Is that a show, or are you just saying you got 2 kids?
I think you're saying that for Frozen 2.
Oh, 2 kids. Oh, gotcha. Yeah. Frozen 2 is now out on Disney Plus. Yeah.
Have you seen The Mandalorian, Paul?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've watched that. So what I'm watching now is I really only watch TV on Sundays, but on Sundays I binge something, or Saturday nights. I guess I give myself permission to binge on Saturday nights too. I think I'm gonna binge the last season of the Clone Wars on Disney Plus. It's the animated series.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a big fan of The Mandalorian, and I'm looking forward to the next season coming out. All right. Well, I don't know what time it is. What time is it, guys?
6:50.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I'll stay as long as you need, but if we've kind of covered it, then we can bounce, or if we've got any more questions about how to do this, we can ask.
Looks like we're all good on Facebook.
Okay. We kind of dried up things up there. Okay. So we'll bounce. You betcha. Glad you joined, and I'll make sure and send these slides and documents out to everybody that signed up. I appreciate y'all's time.
Happy Easter to you guys.
Happy Easter.